I'm a researcher based at the University of Oxford Centre for Criminology. I currently work on two projects. One is looking at how the Criminal Cases Review Commission reviews wrongful conviction cases, and the other project is based at Birkbeck, University of London, which is funded by the EU, and I'm currently looking at trafficking of rhino horns. And I've also been working on public attitudes to death penalty in Japan for the last 5 years. And the first time I became interested in this topic is when I was going through the dialogue between the UN Human Rights Committee and the Japanese government. And the UN Human Rights Committee often argues it's all about human rights, and the Japanese government argues, no, it's about subjective legitimacy, it's about public opinion. We'd like to abolish, but public support is so high that we can't. And I've noticed that they've been communicating from diametrically opposed views for the last 35 years. And what I wanted to do is to find more creative ways in sort of bringing that dialogue forward. And what I wanted to do is to look at the death penalty from the retentionist perspective. It's not just the Japanese government that uses this public opinion argument. Often people argue that the public opinion argument is not principle-based, and I disagree with that. I think it touches upon concepts of democracy, subjective legitimacy. In other words, what the Japanese government's saying is that if you abolish the death penalty, the trust in the criminal justice system would erode, and that may lead to, for example, the Japanese public not wanting to report crimes to the police or cooperate with them, and in the worst case scenario, the victims could take justice into their own hands. But this is a very extreme scenario, but still a theoretically valid one in my view. But the weakness of this argument is that it rests on empirical evidence. And the empirical evidence that the Japanese government uses is their own government survey. And often the survey results are taken at face value. And I wanted to look much closer in how the Japanese government reaches this figure of, in the latest opinion poll in 2009, was 86% support. And what my research shows is that if you look at the questions, I don't think it's a completely objective question. I think there are some problems with sampling error, correcting the sampling errors. And I also conducted my own surveys back in 2009, 2010, and from that I was able to show that Japanese public do not know much about the death penalty, and if you provide them with information, their support often declines. And this is also true for those who originally state that they strongly support the death penalty. And what's really interesting is that those people who say that they strongly support were the people who are most malleable to information. I think my research shows that public attitude is a lot more nuanced and malleable, but I also don't agree with the argument that we should educate the Japanese public until the poll reaches 51-60%, and I think this argument is very superficial in the sense that I think the Japanese government needs to look beyond the superficial representation of public attitudes. The government has signed the ICCPR, which clearly states that abolition is desirable and that they would need to work towards it. Therefore, I think the government should not be asking whether the public supports or wants to abolish the death penalty. I think the question should be whether the public will accept and tolerate abolition. And I think this way we could reflect public opinion, but also take political leadership. And I think it's probably a good balance to have. As a social scientist, I don't disagree with using surveys to measure public's policy preferences, and I think it's necessary in a democratic setting. But if the government wants to execute on behalf of public opinion, then I think the evidence needs to be sound. And at the moment, the Japanese government evidence, I don't think it's strong enough to support its claim.